The evening sun was sliding behind the red cliffs when the wind began to change. It came down from the high mesas carrying the smell of dust, sage, and faint smoke from somewhere far off. The woman felt it before she saw anything, an uneasy stillness in the air, as though the land itself was holding its breath. She sat by the dying fire, one hand resting on her swollen belly, listening to the desert's silence. Her horse was tethered a few yards away, shifting nervously, ears twitching at something unseen. She had been on the trail since dawn, following the old wagon road that wound between the cliffs. There were no towns for miles, only scattered ruins and dry creek beds. Her canteen was half empty, and her body ached from the long ride, but she had kept going, driven by something she couldn't name, maybe fear, maybe hope. The desert didn't care either way. It simply watched, endless and indifferent, as people came and went, leaving only footprints that the wind soon erased. When she first saw him, she thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow moved against the canyon wall, slipping from rock to rock, silent as smoke. The horse snorted, backing up, and her hand went instinctively to the small pistol strapped beneath her coat. Then the figure stepped into the fading sunlight, a tall man, lean and rough, skin weathered by sun and eyes that held both warning and weariness. His dark hair was bound loosely, and across his chest hung a leather strap. Worn smooth by years of use, he stopped a few paces away, not speaking, his gaze moving from her face to the curve of her belly. The woman felt her pulse quicken. She had heard stories about Apache warriors still roaming these lands long after most had disappeared or been forced away. Some said they haunted the old trails, protecting what was left of their home. Others said they had become ghosts caught between two worlds. "I don't want trouble," she said quietly, keeping her voice steady. "Just passing through." The man's expression didn't change. He looked at her as though measuring something unseen. Then he said, "You shouldn't be here." "Ah!" His voice was low, carrying the roughness of someone who had spoken little for a long time. "I could say the same to you," she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. "There's nothing out here but wind and bones." He almost smiled at that, though it never reached his eyes. "Wind and bones," he repeated, glancing toward the cliffs. "You're right about that." He turned slightly as if to leave, then paused. "You're alone?" She hesitated. "I was with a wagon train. They went another way." His eyes flickered toward the horizon. "You lost them." "I left them," she said, almost whispering. He studied her again, and for a moment the silence between them was heavy. Then he nodded once, like a man who understood things without needing them, explained. "The night will come fast," he said. "Stay near the rocks. The wind shifts after dark." She wasn't sure what he meant, but something in his tone kept her from asking. He moved toward the shadows again, and in another breath he was gone. The desert swallowed him as though he had never been there. She sat by the fire long after the last light faded. Every sound seemed louder. Now the distant cry of a coyote, the dry whisper of sand moving across stone. Her hands trembled as she tried to feed the fire, and for the first time in days, she felt tears gathering behind her eyes. She didn't know if it was from fear or relief. Maybe both, but when she looked up, she saw him again standing just beyond the firelight. This time, there was something in his hand, something glinting faintly. She stiffened, reaching for her pistol, but he lifted his other hand slowly, palm outward. "You dropped this," he said, stepping closer. It was a silver locket, her mother's, which must have fallen from her bag. She took it, murmuring a thank you. Up close, she could see that he was hurt. The sleeve of his shirt was torn, and dark stains marked the fabric near his ribs. "You're bleeding," she said, voice soft with surprise. He glanced down at it, as if just noticing. "It's nothing." "It doesn't look like nothing," she insisted. "You need help." He shook his head, lowering himself to the ground with a grimace. "Help won't change what's coming." His words made her uneasy. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked into the fire, the orange glow flickering across his scarred face. "You said you were alone," he said finally. "That's not true." Her heart tightened. "What do you mean I'm not alone?" He turned his head slightly, eyes searching the darkness beyond the flames. "They followed you. The men from your wagon train, They're not far. She froze, every muscle tensing. That's not possible. They went north. Not all of them, he said. Some stayed behind. I saw their tracks by the ridge. 3 horses, maybe 4. They've been following your trail since morning. The fire crackled between them, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Her mind went back to the last night with the wagon group, the argument. Shouting, the man who had grabbed her arm and said she'd never make it on her own. She had left before sunrise, too frightened to look back. Why would they follow me? She whispered. He looked at her with eyes that seemed to hold both pity and warning. Because they think you have something worth taking. Her hands went to her belly again. They wouldn't, they would, he said quietly. The world out here is not kind. The fire popped, and sparks drifted upward into the cooling night. She didn't know what to say. The desert that had seemed empty now felt alive, watching, waiting. She could almost feel the eyes on her, just beyond the circle of light. The man reached into his pack and pulled out a small knife, its handle wrapped in hide. If you stay here, they'll find you before dawn. If you ride east, you'll die before sunrise. The land's too rough. The only way is through the canyon. She shook her head. That's Apache land, isn't it? It was, he said. Now it's just forgotten, like everything else. She looked at him, her heart pounding, trying to read the truth in his face. Why are you helping me? He didn't answer for a long time. The wind shifted again, stirring the ashes. Then he said, because once someone helped me when they shouldn't have. She studied him in the firelight, unsure whether to trust him or fear him. His face was calm, but his hands were trembling slightly, blood still seeping from the wound in his side. You need to rest, she said, moving closer. Let me see that. He caught her wrist before she could touch him. His grip was strong despite the pain. No, he said firmly. You don't understand. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Then tell me. He looked past her again, toward the darkness that pressed against the firelight. They're closer than I thought, he murmured. Then his eyes met hers, sharp and burning with something she couldn't name. Wait, she whispered, suddenly afraid. You're bleeding. The Apache looked at her, his breath shallow. And what he said next froze her blood. The fire hissed as the wind rose, and somewhere in the distance, a horse screamed. The woman clutched her belly, her heartbeat pounding in her ears, staring at him in disbelief. His words echoed in her mind, unraveling everything she thought she knew. And before she could speak again, the night swallowed them both. The fire burned low as the woman tried to make sense of what he had said. His voice had been steady but cold, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had already accepted what was coming. She wanted to believe she had misheard him, that it was just the wind twisting his words. But the look in his eyes told her it was real. Fear gripped her chest like a fist. The baby moved inside her, a small flutter that pulled her back from the edge of panic. She had to think. She had to stay calm. The Apache sat still, his hand pressed against his wound. The blood had slowed, but his breathing was uneven. He seemed to be listening to something she couldn't hear. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked toward the darkness beyond the fire, as though he expected it to move. The woman followed his gaze, seeing only shapes of stone and brush in the dim light. But the silence had changed. The desert had gone too quiet, as if every creature had vanished into hiding. What did you mean? She finally asked, her voice shaking. What did you say? He didn't look at her. They're here, he said. Closer than before. You can smell them if the wind turns. Her stomach tightened. Who? The men from the wagon. He nodded once. They want what you carry. They'll take it if they find you. She touched her belly again, trembling. You don't even know me. I know enough, he said quietly. I saw the tracks. The way they split off. The one who rides with the broken boot heel, he's been behind you for days. You didn't notice because you wanted to believe you were safe. Her throat felt dry. How do you know all this? He gave a faint, tired smile. Because I used to track men like that. The words hung heavy between them. The woman studied his face in the dim firelight. There was something strange in his calmness, something that didn't match the danger he spoke of. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't running. It was as if he had already decided how this night would end. She looked at the dark stain spreading across his shirt. "You'll bleed to death if we don't stop it." "I've seen worse," he said. "But I won't make it far if we ride." "Then we stay and fight?" she asked. He shook his head. "You can't fight them." "Not like this." "Then what do you want me to do?" He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something softer. "Live," he said. "That's what you do." A gust of wind swept through, scattering ashes across the sand. The fire dimmed, and she felt the temperature drop sharply. The desert could turn cruel after dark, and the cold bit through her thin coat. The Apache reached into his pack and pulled out a strip of cloth, pressing it against his side. She could see his hands trembling now. Without thinking, she moved closer, tearing a piece from her shawl. "Here," she said. "Let me help." He hesitated, then nodded once. She tied the fabric tight around his ribs, trying not to notice the warmth of the blood on her fingers. When she finished, he exhaled slowly. "You have a steady hand," he said. "I was a nurse," she replied quietly. "Back east. Before the war took everything." He looked at her with new understanding. "That's why you're out here." She nodded. "After the fighting, there was nothing left. I thought maybe the West would be different." "It's not," he said. "It just hides its wounds better." His words stung with truth. She glanced toward the fire, remembering the long road behind Hertha, ruined towns. The burned fields, the empty eyes of people who had lost too much. Out here, she had hoped for peace. Instead, she found more ghosts. "Why were you following me?" she asked after a long silence. He looked away. "I wasn't following you. I was following them, the men." He nodded. "They took something from my people. I thought I could take it back." Her heart pounded. "And now they're after me." "They think you know where it is," he said. "Maybe one of them saw you pick up something you didn't even notice. Maybe they think you're hiding it." She frowned, trying to remember. The last few days were a blur of dust and exhaustion. She remembered the wagon breaking down, the argument, the shouting. She remembered a satchel one of the men had dropped something heavy that she had used to balance her supplies. It was still tied to her horse's saddle. "What if I do have it?" she said softly. His eyes hardened. "Then they won't stop until they find you." The fire snapped, sending a brief spark into the air. Somewhere beyond the rocks, a coyote gave a long, low howl. The woman shivered. "You said the canyon's the only way," she said. "Why?" "It's narrow and steep. They can't ride through it fast. If we reach the far end before dawn, they'll lose our trail." She nodded slowly. "Then we go now." He hesitated. "You sure you can ride?" "I don't have a choice," she said. "Neither of us does." He gave a small nod and pushed himself to his feet with effort. The wound had weakened him, but his movements were still precise, like someone used to pain. He packed the few things he had and scattered the fire with his boot until only glowing embers remained. The desert went dark around them, lit only by the pale shimmer of the moon. They mounted the horses and started toward the canyon. The wind had picked up, carrying the faint scent of smoke and sweat. The woman kept glancing back, half expecting to see figures rising from the shadows. The Apache rode ahead, guiding the way through the twisting trail. The land was quiet except for the sound of hoofs on stone and the distant cry of an owl. The cliffs rose higher on each side, closing in like walls. The moonlight painted the rocks silver, and their shadows stretched long across the sand. Every sound seemed sharper here, echoing off the stone. "How did you get hurt?" she asked after a while. He didn't answer at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "One of them caught me by the river this morning. He thought he could finish what he started years ago. So this isn't the first time." "No," he said. "They killed my brother. Burned our camp. I've been tracking them ever since." She glanced at him, seeing more than just the wound. There was grief in his eyes, old and deep. He wasn't just a man surviving the desert. He was a man carrying the weight of everything he had lost. "Then why help me?" she asked again. He didn't look at her. "Because they'll use you to draw me out. They already tried once before. I won't let it happen again." The air grew colder as they went deeper into the canyon. The moon slipped behind the cliffs, leaving them in near darkness. She could hear the sound of water somewhere below, trickling through the rocks. Her horse stumbled once, and she gripped the reins tighter. "We'll stop soon," he said. "There's a cave ahead. We can rest there for a while." She didn't argue. Her body ached, and her thoughts were spinning. When they reached the cave, it was barely large enough for the horses. The air inside smelled of damp earth and smoke from old fires. She sat near the entrance while he checked the trail behind them. "They're still out there," he said quietly when he returned, "but not close yet." She leaned back against the cold stone. "How long can we keep ahead of them?" "As long as you can ride." She looked at him, her voice trembling. "And if I can't?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched between them again. She could hear his breathing, rough and uneven, and the soft rustle of fabric as he pressed his hand to his side. He was losing strength, she could tell. Yet his eyes never left the canyon mouth, always watching, always listening. "What if you're wrong?" she asked suddenly. "What if they're not after me at all?" He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Then you still have to survive long enough to find out." The wind moaned outside, sliding through the narrow canyon like a voice whispering secrets. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her. The baby shifted again, a small reminder of the life inside her. She wondered what kind of world she was bringing it into, a world of dust and shadows, of people running from ghosts. When she opened her eyes, the Apache was still awake, his face pale in the dim light. "If I don't make it," he said suddenly, "you keep going? Follow the river until the land opens. You'll find a trading post 2 days from there. You're not going to die," she said, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the darkness outside the cave. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "They're moving again." She followed his eyes, but saw only blackness. The night pressed in around them, silent and waiting. Somewhere out there, horses were moving slow, careful, deliberate. Her heart began to race as she reached for her pistol. The Apache didn't move. He just listened, every muscle tense, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. "Stay quiet," he murmured. The sound grew closer, a faint jingle of metal. A muffled voice carried on the wind. Then the smell of smoke again, sharper now. "They found the fire," he said under his breath. The woman's pulse thundered in her ears. She held her breath, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to appear. The air felt thick with dread. The Apache's hand tightened on his knife. Then, from far down the canyon, came the unmistakable echo of a gunshot. The sound rolled through the night, and the woman felt her blood turn cold. The Apache rose slowly, eyes burning in the dim light. "They know where we are," he said. And before she could speak, he reached for her hand and pulled her to her feet. "Run," he whispered. The sound of the gunshot still echoed between the canyon walls when the Apache pulled her into the shadows. The horses reared, frightened by the sudden noise, and she stumbled, clutching his arm to steady herself. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, and guided her deeper into the narrow passage. The air was cold and dry, filled with the smell of dust and stone. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Drowning out everything else, they moved in silence, the ground uneven beneath their boots. Behind them, faint voices drifted through the canyon low, angry tones mixed with the clinking of metal. The woman couldn't make out words, but she knew what they meant. The men had found the trail. The fire she thought was small enough to hide had betrayed them. The Apache stopped suddenly and motioned for her to stay close to the rock wall. He crouched, listening. She could see the outline of his face, tense and focused, every sense alert. The wind carried the faint sound of a horse's snort and boots scuffing on gravel. Then silence again. "They're splitting up," he whispered. "Two to the ridge, one coming straight through."
How do you know?"
she asked softly. "I would do the same," he said. "One watches, one drives, one kills." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "What do we do?" He looked at her with a calmness that made her stomach twist. "We move faster," They continued deeper into the canyon, moving quickly but carefully. The walls seemed to close in around them, and the moonlight barely reached the ground. Her legs ached, and her back throbbed from carrying the weight of her unborn child, but she didn't dare slow down. The Apache walked ahead, every step precise, his knife held low in one hand. After what felt like hours, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking a dry riverbed. The Apache stopped, scanning the terrain. "We'll rest here," he said. "They'll have to go around the rocks. It'll buy us time." She collapsed against the stone, gasping for air. The silence felt heavy, broken only by the wind and her ragged breathing. The Apache knelt beside her, checking the sky. His wound had reopened. She could see the dark stain spreading again, but he didn't complain. "You need to stop the bleeding," she said. "You can't keep going like this." He shook his head. "If I stop now, they'll find us. You'll die before they do," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. He looked at her, his eyes calm. "If that happens, you take my horse and follow the river. Promise me, not leaving you," she said. "You don't get to choose that." He replied softly. Something about his tone made her fall silent. She could see the years in his face, the kind of strength that came from surviving too much. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a man carrying ghosts. The moon slipped behind the cliffs again, and the darkness thickened. Somewhere behind them, a loose rock tumbled, and the sound echoed like thunder. The woman froze. The Apache turned his head sharply toward the sound, then gestured for her to stay low. He crept forward, moving silently until he disappeared into the shadows. She waited, her hands pressed to her belly, listening for any sound that might tell her what was happening. Her breath came in short bursts. Every minute felt longer than the last. Then, a faint scuffle broke the silence, a muffled cry. The scrape of boots on stone, and then quiet again. The Apache returned a moment later, his expression hard. "One of them was close," he said. "What did you do?" He didn't answer right away. "He won't follow anymore," he said simply. She swallowed, not sure she wanted to ask more. The night felt heavier now, thick with fear and questions. She wanted to believe they could make it out, but the thought of what might be waiting ahead haunted her. When dawn finally began to touch the edge of the canyon, the sky turned pale gray. They had made it through the night, but it didn't feel like safety. The Apache sat apart, watching the horizon. She could see how pale he had grown, his body shaking slightly from exhaustion and loss of blood. She moved closer, pulling the shawl tighter around him. "You need rest," she said. He didn't look at her. "Rest is for people who have a place to return to." "Then what about you?" she asked. He turned toward her, and his voice was quiet when he said, "I buried my home a long time ago." She looked away, unsure how to answer. Her mind drifted to her own losses, the home that burned, the husband who never returned from the war, the nights spent listening to the sound of marching boots and gunfire. Maybe that was why she had left everything behind. She had nothing left to lose. As they sat there, the faint sound of horses echoed again. It came from far off, but was moving closer. The Apache's jaw tightened. "They found the trail again," he said. "We move now." The woman forced herself up, pain shooting through her legs. Her body begged for rest, but she followed him without question. They climbed down the ledge and crossed the riverbed, the sand crunching softly underfoot. The morning sun had barely risen, but the air was already warming after a while. The canyon opened into a wide stretch of desert scattered with dry brush and scattered bones of old trees. In the distance, she could see the faint outline of mountains. The Apache stopped beside a small rise and pointed ahead. "That ridge marks the end of the canyon. Once we reach it, we'll follow the stream east." "What about them?" she asked. He looked back, his eyes narrowing. "They'll keep coming. Men like that don't give up easy." "Why do they want it so badly?" she asked. "What was taken from your people?" He hesitated before answering. "A map," he said. "Drawn by the elders, long before the wars. It shows the hidden valleys, the sacred springs, places no white man has ever seen. They think it leads to gold." "Does it?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "It leads to life, not gold. But they'll never understand that." The woman thought of the satchel tied to her saddle. The weight of it suddenly felt heavier. She wondered if that was what they were chasing her for, a piece of paper that meant nothing to her but everything to him. As the day wore on, the sun grew harsh, burning against their backs. They stopped once to drink from a shallow pool, the water warm and bitter. The Apache's movements were slower now, his strength fading. She tried to hide her worry, but he saw it anyway. "You think I won't make it?" he said. "I think you're too stubborn to stop," she replied. That earned a small laugh from him, rough but genuine. "Maybe stubbornness is all that's left of me." She wanted to say something comforting, but before she could, the sound of hooves broke through the still air again, this time closer. The Apache turned sharply, his expression hardening. "They're coming fast," he said. "Too close." He looked around quickly, his eyes scanning the land. Then he pointed toward a cluster of rocks ahead. "There, we'll make our stand there." The woman felt panic rise in her chest. "You can't fight them alone." "I'm not alone," he said. "You'll be my eyes." They ran toward the rocks, crouching behind the largest one. The Apache loaded his rifle, each movement precise despite his pain. She knelt beside him, clutching her pistol, trying to steady her shaking hands. The first rider appeared on the ridge, then another. Sunlight glinted off metal as they moved closer, spreading out to surround the area. The Apache's eyes narrowed. "3 left," he said. 2 to the west, 1 circling. "What if there are more?" "Then we make them count," he said. The wind picked up again, swirling dust around them. The woman could taste fear in her mouth, sharp and bitter. Her heart raced as the riders drew closer. Their shapes clearer now, men with rifles and hard faces. Men who had chosen greed over mercy. One of them shouted something, his voice echoing off the rocks. The Apache didn't answer. He raised his rifle and fired once. The shot rang out across the desert, and one of the riders fell from his horse. The others scattered, returning fire. Bullets struck the rocks around them, sending shards of stone flying. The woman ducked, covering her head, feeling the hot sting of dust against her skin. The Apache reloaded quickly, firing again. She saw his jaw tighten with pain each time he moved. The men were shouting now, trying to flank them. She gripped her pistol, her hands slick with sweat, waiting for one to get close enough then, from the corner of her eye. She saw a movement, a shadow, slipping along the ridge behind them. "There's one more," she whispered. "He's behind us." The Apache turned sharply, but before he could raise his rifle, a shot rang out. He stumbled, the impact driving him to one knee. The woman screamed, grabbing his arm. He looked at her, his eyes fierce but fading. "Don't stop," he said through clenched teeth. "You run, now." She shook her head. "I can't." He grabbed her wrist, forcing the pistol into her hand. "You can." The sound of boots on stone came closer. The men were almost upon them. The woman's breath came fast, her whole body trembling. She looked at the Apache, at the pain in his eyes, at the strength still burning there despite everything, and then she turned toward the ridge, raising the pistol as the first man appeared through the dust. The wind howled through the canyon, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The battle was only beginning. The sound of her heartbeat filled her ears as she raised the pistol, her arms shaking from fear and exhaustion. Dust swirled around her face, blurring the world into shades of brown and gold. The first man emerged from the haze, a tall figure with a rifle in his hands, and a cruel grin stretched across his face. His eyes locked on her like a predator finding its prey. "End of the road, lady," he said, his voice rough and mocking. The woman didn't move. Her hand trembled, but she kept the pistol aimed. Behind her, the Apache struggled to rise, his hand pressed to the bleeding wound in his side. He tried to lift his rifle again, but his strength was fading fast. "Put the gun down," the man ordered, taking a slow step forward. "You're not going anywhere. You and that savage can both come quiet, or I'll make you wish you had." Something inside her snapped. All the fear, all the pain, all the nights spent running, she wasn't going to be a victim again. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and the pistol fired. The shot cracked through the air, echoing across the canyon. The man staggered back, clutching his shoulder with a cry of surprise and rage. The Apache seized the moment. He lifted his rifle, fired once, and the man fell hard to the ground, motionless. The sound faded into the stillness of the desert, leaving only the whisper of the wind. The woman's chest heaved as she lowered the pistol, her hand trembling uncontrollably. She had never shot anyone before. The Apache turned toward her, breathing heavily, his face pale. "You did what you had to," he said quietly. But there was no time to rest. Another shout came from the west ridge. 2 riders were closing in, their horses kicking up dust. The Apache's gaze hardened. "They'll surround us," he said. "We move now." He staggered as he tried to stand, and she rushed to his side, throwing his arm over her shoulder. His weight nearly knocked her down, but she steadied herself, grit and fear fueling her strength. Together, they moved from rock to rock, using the terrain for cover. Bullets whined past them, splintering stone and kicking up sand. "Keep low," he said through gritted teeth. She nodded, her breath short, her vision swimming from panic and exhaustion. They reached a narrow ravine where the land dipped sharply. The Apache pointed ahead. "Through there, it leads to the dry stream bed." "What about the horses?" she asked, gasping. "They'll find them. We can't stay." They scrambled down the rocky slope, the ground crumbling beneath their boots. Behind them, gunfire echoed again. One bullet struck the stone near her hand, and she cried out as fragments cut her skin. The Apache turned and fired back, forcing the riders to slow. They reached the bottom, the air thick with dust. The ravine twisted ahead, narrow and shadowed, the only path between the canyon walls. The Apache moved slower now, every breath a struggle. Blood stained his shirt, dark and heavy. "You can't keep going like this," she said, her voice breaking. He shook his head. "I've walked farther with worse," he said. Then, after a pause, he added, "Don't let them take the satchel." She glanced at the leather bag tied to her belt. The map, the reason these men had hunted them across the desert. "Why not destroy it?" she asked. "Because it's not just paper," he said, his eyes fixed ahead. "It carries the last of what my people left behind." Something in his voice made her stop arguing. She didn't understand the full truth of it, but she could feel its weight, the sense that this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was about memory, legacy, the last thread of something sacred. They followed the ravine until it opened into a wider basin filled with jagged rocks. A faint trail led upward toward a ridge glowing with the first light of morning. The Apache motioned for her to climb. "You go first," he said. "I'm not leaving you behind," she answered. "You'll only slow me down," he said with a weak grin. "Go. I'll be right behind." She hesitated, then began climbing. Her muscles screamed with each step, but she forced herself upward. The air grew thinner, the climb steeper. She looked down once and saw him still below, steadying himself with his rifle as he followed her. But behind him, at the far end of the basin, figures appeared again, 3 men on foot, rifles raised, moving fast. "Go," he shouted. "Don't stop." The woman climbed faster, her hands slipping on loose stones. She reached the top just as the first bullets struck the rocks around her. She threw herself down, gasping. Below, the Apache took cover behind a boulder. Firing at the men who approached, each shot echoed sharply, followed by answering fire. She watched in horror as one of the bullets grazed his shoulder, spinning him sideways. He staggered but didn't fall. Another shot rang out, closer this time. She saw one of the attackers drop to the ground. The other 2 kept coming. "Come on," she screamed. "You can make it." He didn't answer. His focus was on the fight, on keeping them back. Then his rifle clicked empty. He dropped it, pulled the knife from his belt, and turned toward the shadows where the men advanced. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to climb down to help him, but her body wouldn't move. Fear pinned her where she was. Below, she saw the shapes of men closing in, one from the left, one from behind. "Run," he called out, his voice strained. She shook her head, gripping the pistol again. "Not without you." The gunfire started again, louder now, echoing through the canyon. Dust and smoke filled the air, making it hard to see. She fired once blindly and heard a man yell. The echo faded, leaving only the ragged sound of breathing. When the dust cleared, she saw the Apache standing in the open, knife in hand. One of the men lay still on the ground. The other had retreated to cover reloading. The Apache turned toward her, blood streaking his face. "Go," he shouted again. "It's not your fight." But before she could respond, another gunshot split the air. The Apache fell to one knee, clutching his side. The last man was aiming again, stepping forward to finish it. The woman didn't think. She ran down the ridge, sliding on the loose rocks, her heart hammering. The pistol felt heavy in her hand. The man turned toward her, surprise flashing across his face. He raised his rifle butt. She fired first. The sound was deafening. The man dropped. The echo lingered like a ghost in the air. She stumbled to the Apache's side, her breath coming in gasps. His face was pale, his shirt soaked in blood. "We have to move," she said desperately. More might be coming. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak. "You saved me," he whispered. "That's not how it was supposed to be." She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "You're not dying here. Do you hear me? Not after all this?" He gave a faint smile. "You sound like someone I used to know." She looked around, scanning the canyon. The sun was rising, painting the rocks in shades of red and gold. The light made everything look calm, but the silence was deceiving. Somewhere out there, she knew more of them could be waiting. She helped him to his feet. His arm draped over her shoulder again. Together, they climbed back toward the ridge. Every step felt endless. The desert stretched out before them, vast and empty. And the only sound was the wind moving across the sand. When they reached the top, she turned back for one last look. Smoke curled faintly from the battlefield below. 3 men lay scattered among the rocks. The Apache's horse, spooked by the noise, had wandered to the far side of the basin. Everything looked still, but the stillness didn't feel safe. They moved on, the satchel pressed tight against her chest. The Apache walked slower now, each breath a struggle, but his eyes remained sharp. "You said the river was east," she said. He nodded weakly. "Follow the slope. It'll take us there. Once we reach the water, they can't track us easily." She glanced at him, her jaw tight. "You're sure?" He gave a faint smile. "No, but it's the only chance we have." They walked in silence, the wind rising around them. The desert stretched out ahead, endless and merciless. The woman's mind was filled with questions about the map, about what would happen if they reached the river, about whether anyone would still be waiting for them on the other side. As the day grew hotter, the Apache began to falter. She caught him each time he stumbled, refusing to stop. "You're going to make it," she kept saying. "We're almost there," he didn't answer. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet determination, a flicker of pride that hadn't yet gone out. Then, as they reached the crest of another hill, the sound of horses broke through the wind again. This time there were more. The woman froze. Dust rose on the horizon, shapes moving fast, a dozen riders at least. The Apache's hand went to his knife, but his strength was gone. He looked at her, his eyes steady. "You have to run," he said. "Take the satchel and go." "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If they catch both of us, it's over. But if you run, maybe the story still lives." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "I can't do this alone." He met her gaze, his face calm even through the pain. "You already have." The thunder of hooves grew louder, echoing across the canyon. The woman clutched the satchel tight, torn between running and staying, her heart pounding with fear and grief. The Apache straightened as best he could, gripping his knife, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. The rising sun cast long shadows across the desert, and for a brief, trembling moment, the world seemed to stand still, caught between life and death. Between past and future, the wind carried the sound of his voice as he whispered, "Whatever happens next, don't look back." And then the riders came over the ridge. The horses thundered closer. Storm of dust and hooves that swallowed the sound of the wind. The woman felt her pulse rise until she thought her heart might burst. The Apache stood tall, despite the blood soaking his shirt. Knife gripped tight, eyes burning with the calm fire of someone who had already made peace with fate. She wanted to scream for him to run. She knew he wouldn't. He had made his choice long before this moment. When the riders reached the ridge, the morning light caught their faces, hard men, dust-covered, their rifles drawn. They spread out in a half circle, cutting off escape in every direction. The leader, a man with a scar down his jaw, dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the stones. His eyes landed on the Apache first, then on her, and finally on the satchel clutched against her chest. "So this is what all the fuss was about," he said with a cold smile. "A dying Indian and a runaway woman. You've made us ride a long way." The Apache said nothing. He only shifted his stance slightly, readying himself. The woman's hand went to her pistol, but she knew it was useless against so many. The leader took a few steps closer, his gaze fixed on the satchel. "Give it to me," he said. "You don't even know what you're carrying. That thing isn't worth dying for." The woman's fingers tightened around the strap. "It means something," she said quietly. "More than you'd ever understand." The man laughed. "Maybe to him. To me, it's just gold and land. Same thing it's always been." That was when the Apache spoke, his voice low but steady. "You'll never find what you're looking for in there. The land doesn't belong to you. It never did." The leader's smile faded. "Then I'll take what I can." He raised his rifle. Before he could fire, a sharp crack split the air. A rifle shot from somewhere behind them. One of the riders cried out and fell from his horse. The others turned in shock. Another shot followed, then another. Confusion spread as men ducked for cover. The woman looked toward the canyon rim and saw figures moving to riders. Maybe 3, silhouetted against the rising sun. She didn't know who they were, but their aim was true. The Apache didn't waste the chance. He lunged at the leader, knocking the rifle aside. The 2 men fell hard, rolling in the dust. The leader tried to grab for his pistol, but the Apache's knife flashed once, and it was over. The woman ran to him as the rest of the attackers fled, scattering back toward the desert. The echoes of gunfire faded until there was only silence and the soft rustle of wind over sand. She knelt beside the Apache, her hands shaking. He was breathing hard, his skin pale, but his eyes were still sharp. "You should run," he whispered. "It's over," she said. "They're gone." He shook his head weakly. "There's always another, but you can still make it." She looked up as 2 riders approached the strangers who had fired the saving shots. As they drew near, she recognized one of them, an older man with gray hair under a wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted quickly, his face lined with concern. "Been tracking these men for days," he said. "Saw the smoke and figured trouble found you first." The woman nodded, too shaken to speak. The man knelt beside the Apache, examining the wound. "He's lost too much blood," he said softly. "We'll need to move him if he's going to live." They fashioned a stretcher from blankets and branches, lifting the Apache carefully. He didn't cry out, though his face tightened with pain. The woman walked beside him, holding his hand. Whispering words she barely understood herself. By the time they reached the small river valley, the sun was high, painting the desert in waves of heat. The riders set up camp under a stand of cottonwoods, giving shade and water. The Apache drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow but steady. When he woke that evening, the woman was sitting beside him, holding the satchel in her lap. The firelight flickered across her face, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Then she asked, "What's inside this, really?" He looked at her for a moment, then said, "Stories, maps, songs. My people's way of remembering who we were before they took it all." She opened the flap gently. Inside were folded hides marked with painted symbols, feathers, and a small bundle of earth wrapped in cloth. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's all that's left," he said. "But maybe if you keep it, it won't be forgotten." Her eyes met his, full of sadness and understanding. "You think I can carry that?" He gave a faint smile. "You already have." The next few days passed slowly. The Apache's strength returned little by little, though he could no longer ride far. The older man who had helped them turned out to be a former scout, someone who had once worked both sides of the frontier. He spoke quietly, never asking too many questions, and seemed to understand more than he said. One evening, as the sun set red behind the hills, the woman sat by the river, washing the dust from her hands. The water shimmered gold in the fading light. She thought about everything that had brought her here, the fear, the running, the endless stretch of desert that had almost broken her. The Apache joined her, leaning on a stick for support. "You'll keep going east," he said. "There's a settlement 3 days from here." "Safe enough?" "And you?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon. "My place is here. Always has been." "But I'm glad you came this far," she wanted to argue. To tell him he deserved peace somewhere green and quiet. But she could see in his eyes that his peace was already found. In the sand, the wind, the silence. She nodded instead. "I'll take it with me," she said, touching the satchel. "That's all I ask." That night, they shared their last fire together. He told her stories about his people, about the stars that guided warriors, the spirits in the stones, the songs of the river that once ran full. She listened, committing every word to memory. At dawn, she packed what little they had. The older man gave her a small horse and pointed her toward the rising sun. The Apache stood beside the river, watching her prepare to leave. She rode closer, tears burning in her eyes. "I'll come back," she said. He shook his head gently. "No need, just remember." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and sage. She reached out and touched his hand one last time before turning the horse eastward. The sun rose bright behind her, casting her shadow long over the sand. As she rode away, she looked back once. The Apache was still there, a lone figure against the morning light. The river at his feet, the satchel's absence now part of his peace. Days later, she reached the small town by the river's edge. The people there welcomed her kindly, giving her food and rest. No one asked too much about where she had come from. She kept the satchel close, opening it only at night, when the world was quiet. She would trace the painted symbols, whispering the words she remembered from his stories, afraid that silence would steal them away. In time, the woman built a life. She worked the land, raised her child, and told him stories of a man who had once bled for something more than survival, a man who had taught her what it meant to remember where you come from, even when the world tries to erase it. Years passed. The desert changed little, still fierce and beautiful in its emptiness. Travelers spoke of a solitary Apache who lived by the river, tending to the land and speaking to the wind as if it carried voices. Some said he was a ghost. Others said he was guarding something sacred. The woman never went back. But sometimes, when the wind blew through the valley and the night felt endless, she would close her eyes and hear his voice again, steady, calm, and full of the same strength that had saved her life. And in those moments, she knew that some bonds were not meant to fade. They were carved into the dust, carried by the wind, and written in the blood of those who refused to be forgotten. The desert had taken much from both of them, but it had also given something back, a story of survival, of memory, of courage born in silence. It was not a tale of victory or defeat, but of endurance, and as long as someone remembered, it would never truly end.